Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this live Guide London broadcast, simultaneously broadcasting on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. My name is Pepe Martinez, and I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide, and I'm one of 600 members of the Association of Professional Tour Guides, and we manage the Guide London website and these Guide London broadcasts. As we went into lockdown 6 or 7 weeks ago, rather than just sitting at home, looking at our lovely badges, waiting for tourists that were not going to arrive, we decided to bring London to you. And so we go out live every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 4 o'clock. And each program, we are going to be talking a little bit about some of the culture, some of the fabulous stories, and some of the great historical sites that we have to offer in London. We hope that we whet your appetite, and so that when things return to normal, we hope that London will be at the top of your list. So wherever you are watching from in the world, do let us know in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, and we'll try and give you a shout out at the end. But also, please make sure that you share these broadcasts to your friends as well. We want to spread the word as much as we can. Incredibly, since we started 6 weeks ago, we have been viewed nearly 100,000 times. So thank you to everybody that has taken the time to watch. Now, what have we got for you today, I hear you wonder? Well, today we're going to look at one of London's most fabulous homes. In fact, it's called Kensington Palace. Kensington Palace has been around for 350 years, and for about 75 years was the centre of the British monarchy. Now, it's famous because one of our most famous monarchs, Queen Victoria, was born there. We're going to be hearing a little bit about her later. But more recently, it was known as the home of Diana, Princess of Wales, who was living there when she died in 1997. But more recently again, today, Kensington Palace, not only is it open to the public, but it's also the home of some of our other royals, including William and Kate, and there's 3 kids. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the first of our guest speakers today, and it's my lovely colleague, Leila. Good afternoon, Leila. How are you doing?
Hello, Pepe. Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching, and thank you for hosting, Pepe. I'm very well. I hope you are well as well. I am a Blue Badge guide for London and region. I qualified in 2018, so this is my 3rd season. I do most of the things that all the Blue Badge guides do, but my specialities are art, ancient civilizations and prehistory, and above all, royal history. And today I'm going to talk about Kensington Palace, which is my favorite.
Thank you, Leila. I'm particularly looking forward to some of the gossipy stories that you'll have for us. Thank you. Now, also, we're going to be talking today on today's program about one of Kensington Palace's most famous residents. In fact, she was born there and spent the first 18 years of her life, Queen Victoria. And here's my colleague Nick, who's going to be telling us all about the life of Queen Victoria a bit later. Good afternoon, Nick.
Hi, Pepe. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm good. So my name is Nick Salmond. I qualified as a Blue Badge guide just over a year ago, 2019. So I had a great year last year guiding for the first year. And then, of course, lockdowns come, so we can't do any guiding at the moment. But hopefully it will return later this year. And I look forward to showing people some of the wonders of London over the next few months.
Thank you, Nick. And what is it about Queen Victoria that you find particularly interesting?
So I've been interested in Victoria and her family since I was a kid. Before I trained as a Blue Badge guide, I worked for the National Trust as well at a place called Hewington Manor. It's just outside London. That's the former home of Benjamin Disraeli, who was one of Queen Victoria's favourite prime ministers. So I learned a lot more about the Queen there as well, and I hopefully give you some interesting snippets later on.
Thanks, Nick. So I look forward to hearing you. So we'll wave goodbye to you just for now. And Leila, it's...
Thank you, Pepe. Thank you. So here we are. We're looking now at the glorious view of the private part of Kensington Palace. So if you were coming to Kensington Palace, you would be entering it through the door that you could see further in the middle. And in front of all this view is the white marble statue of Queen Victoria, made by her rebellious daughter, Princess Louise, who studied art against her mother's will. And it was Victoria who opened her childhood home to the public on her 80th birthday in 1899. Well, I'm not going to talk anymore about Queen Victoria because Nick is going to talk to you about her. But today I'm going to take you inside the palace, into the state apartments, which are amazing apartments which are open to the public. The oldest part dates back to the 1690s, and then the other part to the 1720s. But just before we go inside, there are some views that you might be familiar with, or I want to remind you of those pictures. So can we see the next slide, please, with the gate, the Golden Gate? Yes, the Golden Gate. You might be familiar with the view of this elegant 18th century gate, which is the most ornamental feature of the exterior of the palace. But if you came here in September of 1997, you would have seen this. These millions of flowers and tributes laid for Princess Diana after her death. So this was her official residence. That's where she lived with Prince Charles while they were married. And after the separation, Prince Charles moved away while Diana stayed here with children, which means that both boys, Prince William and Prince Harry, can call Kensington Palace their home. Prince William is living in the former apartments of his great aunt, Princess Margaret. She lived here. She held her bohemian parties in Kensington Palace. And if you watched The Crown, you know what I'm talking about. So home for loads and loads of royal people. And it's still like a royal village. There are a few cousins of the Queen living there, and also Princess Eugenie, the another granddaughter of the Queen. But now let's have a look at the next slide. Yes, this is the sunken garden. It's easy to miss it if you are visiting the palace, but please remember to have a look at it. It's a lovely garden. And in 2017, the engagement photographs of Guess Who were taken in this garden. Yes, that was Prince Harry and Meghan. So if you want, you can Google them. You would see this garden, also some filmed footage here. Yes, so now I think it's time to go inside because I have to show you some rooms. We're going to look, first of all, at the portrait of William and Mary. They are important because this palace was built for them. They came from Holland to become king and queen of this country in the event called the Glorious Revolution. But you can learn more about this event when you get back to the palace. I could talk for hours about history, but my task today is just to give you a flavor of this place. So, William had asthma and he needed fresh countryside air. Kensington Palace was built as a countryside residence. And the Queen's State Apartments are the oldest apartments of the palace that exist today. Let's just have a look at this slide of the small room. Yeah, the next one. Yes, thank you. Yes, this gives you an impression of one of the rooms of the Queen's State Apartments. Warm oak paneling, Chinese porcelain, Japanese lacquered furniture. These were new styles and tastes introduced here with William and Mary. And it reflects this warmth and intimacy and domesticity of the palace. Very Dutch style. To be honest, this is my favorite part of the palace. That's where you can feel this warmth and homely feeling. And whatever other people think, I don't know, but I would really like to stay there overnight because even if there are some ghosts, I think they are really benevolent. They're just bringing this palace and all the history and stories back to life. Now, the other part of the palace looks very, very different. It's much more opulent. It's much more impressive, if you like. And it was designed a little bit later in the 1720s for the next generation of kings that we call Georgians or Hanoverians. They came to the throne after the death of Queen Anne. Queen Anne, by the way, was a sister, younger sister of Queen Mary. And if you watched The Favourite, the Oscar-winning film, you are familiar with the notorious side of Queen Anne, but she was a tragic queen who lost 17 or actually 18 of her children. And she was succeeded by a distant relative from Hanover in Germany who didn't speak English, who was 54, but he was a Protestant. And he became George the First. George I of England, Ireland, and Scotland. And this staircase that you see on this picture was designed for him. There are two pictures on this slide. One picture is a drawing, about 200 years old drawing on the left, and another one is a recent photograph on the right. And you can see that it looks more or less different, more or less the same. So it actually didn't change during these 300 years. People depicted on these on this staircase, on these paintings, are real courtiers who accompanied George I when he came to this country from Hanover. He brought about 80 courtiers, his German court, and some Turkish servants as well. And amazingly, you can still see them painted here. One of them, Peter the Wild Boy, you can Google him, do your own research. He is painted here. He was an autistic boy who was kept for entertainment in the palace. Two Turkish servants, Mehmet and Mustafa. One of them was the groom of the stool, a very, very honorable position at court. Well, basically, he had to look after the toilet of the king. He would need to assist the king in the toilet. And talking about the toilet, the son of George I, George II, died here in the palace on a toilet. Ironically, he was the last British monarch who led his troops to battle in person, but he met this death, which was not very glorious. So imagine you are a courtier, or you are somebody who wants to get into the palace, and you are going up these stairs. These courtiers are looking at you, and if you are allowed to enter, this would be the first room that you're entering, the king's presence chamber. Even if the king was not here, you would need to bow to the throne. If you were lucky enough, if you were dressed up appropriately, wearing really, really expensive clothes according to the court fashion, if you knew the court etiquette, if you managed not to make too many enemies, you possibly could manage to make it to the top of high society, because there was a sequence of rooms. This was like a filter through which people tried to get to the very top, and every other room is more and more exclusive. Now, let's have a look at the next room. This is probably the most opulent room of the king's state apartments, the cupola room, with gilded chandeliers, with a painted ceiling, dome ceiling. Also, you might notice golden statues in the niches. Well, they're gilded statues of the Roman gods, and the whole room is designed in the imperial Roman style. There was a point designing it in this way. Painted by William Kent, a young architect and artist who came back from Italy. This was his first commission, and he brought Italy to Britain, and he linked these British kings to the Roman emperor. So that was the point. The British Empire was the heir to the Roman Empire. The most curious object in this room is probably this thing in the middle. You might be wondering what that is. This is the musical clock. Musical mechanism was placed in the lower section of it. It's not there anymore, but it is still in the royal collection, and it might be repaired and then placed back in this clock again. It might play music again one day. George Frederick Handel was one of those composers who wrote music to this clock. He was a court composer to George I and George II. Also in the distance, notice these mannequins wearing costumes that reflect the court fashion of the 1730s, let's say. And believe me, parties are still held in this palace. Well, if you have about £100,000 to spare, you might want to celebrate your birthday here, maybe your wedding. And Kensington Palace was voted as the highest status venue for events in the world. That was a few years ago, but believe me, it's in a very, very special place. And if you decide to hire the rooms, all the money would go to the maintenance and upkeep of the palace. It doesn't go to the royal pocket. Now, the last thing that I wanted to say about this room, yes, that in 1819, a Christian ceremony was held in this room. This was the christening of a baby girl that was born in this palace. She was christened Alexandrina Victoria, and the Roman statues in the niches were covered with curtains for this event because it was inappropriate. So the last picture shows Victoria in her coronation robes, and she's becoming queen. She's leaving Kensington Palace, and later on she's opening it for the public. And in most cases you would always see something about Queen Victoria at Kensington Palace, but I will leave it to Nick to talk about Queen Victoria, and I'm looking forward to hear to it myself. Thank you very much.
Leah, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Yes, I'm going to talk about this lady here, Queen Victoria, who was born in the palace in 1819. But this is a picture of her at the end of her life. This is probably the image of Victoria you probably remember, if the image that comes into your mind if someone mentions Queen Victoria, looking very imperial, quite serious, dressed in black, covered in jewels, and looking very stern. This is actually the official picture that was taken for her Diamond Jubilee to mark 60 years on the throne. And Queen Victoria is one of only 2 monarchs in the entire British history to have reached that milestone of 60 years on the throne. And the only other one, of course, our current Queen, who reached 68 years earlier this year. So this is Queen Victoria at the age of 78, which means, of course, she came to the throne when she was 18. And if we look at the next picture, you can see that fateful morning in June of 1837 when the young Victoria was woken very early. She was woken by her mother at 6 in the morning, and she was told that there were 2 gentlemen to see her. So she came down in her dressing gown, and she met the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain. And they told her they'd been at Windsor Castle overnight, where at 2:10 in the morning, her uncle, King William IV, had died. And as a result, Victoria was now Queen. Not Queen, of course, not only of Great Britain and Ireland, but of all the dominions across the sea, the vast British Empire. So a huge amount of the world's population now had this young teenager as their head of state. Quite an awesome responsibility to put on the shoulders of a young teenager. But it was a responsibility that Victoria had been expecting. She'd grown up knowing that she would be the next queen. She'd grown up in Kensington Palace, under a system called the Kensington system, devised by her mother. Her father had died when she was just a few months old, so this system was really devised to keep the young Victoria under her mother's control. Things like she wasn't allowed to sleep in her own bedroom, she had to sleep in her mother's room. She wasn't even allowed to walk downstairs on her own, she had to have a servant or a friend holding her hand. That was all designed to keep Victoria under the control of her mother. Well, she was 18 when she came to the throne, so she didn't need her mother anymore. She was allowed to rule without her mother's consent. And one of the first things that Victoria did was to order her bed be moved out of her mother's bedroom. And within a few months, she'd exited the palace altogether and gone to live at Buckingham Palace, which had just been completed. That first day, Victoria held her first meeting of the Privy Council. That's the body that advises the monarch. And by all accounts, she did very well at that meeting. The Duke of Wellington was there. He had defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo some 20 years before. And now he was attending as this older statesman. And he said the young queen not only filled the chair she sat in, she filled the room with her presence. He was so impressed at the way that Victoria comported herself on that day. Now, if we talk about Victoria, we've got to talk about Albert as well. The two names go together. And the next picture shows the marriage of Victoria and Albert. Now, they were first cousins. They shared grandparents through Victoria's mother, but they didn't actually meet until they were 16 years old. Albert grew up in Germany and Victoria grew up in London. But Albert came to London for a party to help mark Victoria's 17th birthday. And they met on the stairs in Kensington Palace, the same stairs that you go up as you enter Victoria's apartments today. They were quite impressed with what they saw. Victoria kept a journal all through her life, and she wrote about that meeting, that first time she saw Albert. She thought he was a bit too stout compared with his brother, but she thought he had beautiful eyes, blue eyes, and a beautiful nose. And then she wrote to her uncle Leopold saying that he had a pleasing and delightful exterior. What more could you want in a future husband than to find one with a pleasing and delightful exterior? And it was actually 3 years before they got married. Albert had gone back to Germany. They carried on writing, but Albert came back to Britain in 1839. And it was Victoria who proposed, and they were married in 1840. This is the marriage ceremony. It took place at St. James's Palace, which is a private royal palace, still in London, just off the Mall today. It's not open to the public. There's still royal events take place in this chapel. The last big royal event was the christening of Prince Louis, Prince William's youngest son, which took place in 2018. But this is the marriage, and look at Victoria dressed in white. Not unusual, you might think, for a bride to be dressed in white. In fact, it was very unusual for the time. Brides generally weren't dressed in white. It was Victoria who started that trend and started that fashion, and that's still the case today. Most weddings, you will find the bride dressed in white. Now, Victoria and Albert had a very different marriage to the type of marriages that royal personages had at the time. Most royal marriages were done for political reasons, not for any reasons of love. And as a result, the husband and wife often really didn't like each other. In fact, sometimes they absolutely detested each other. If you look at George III's children, and he had 15 children, out of all their children, George III's grandchildren, there were over 50 of them, and 95% of them were illegitimate because his children had their children with their mistresses and not their wives. Victoria was one of the few legitimate grandchildren of George III, which is, of course, why she eventually became queen. Now, Albert and Victoria had a very different marriage. They were deeply in love. They found each other incredibly attractive. This next image shows Albert's favourite picture of Victoria. This is not the usual picture you see of Victoria with her hair up, looking very prim and proper. This is the Queen literally with her hair down, cascading over her shoulder, even a bit of bare shoulder in the picture here, which is quite scandalous by Victorian times. No wonder Albert liked this picture so much. Victoria was equally enamoured of Albert, and she wrote about it in her journal. She kept a journal through her life, and you can actually read her journals online. Just go and search for Queen Victoria's journals. They're all available for free to read online. Some of the later ones were heavily redacted after Victoria died by her daughter, but the early ones are more or less left intact. And she wrote some quite racy things about Albert. She wrote about their wedding night. She wrote about lying in his arms, watching dawn break, for we did not sleep much that night, she said. She wrote about watching him shave. She found that very exciting. And she loved the way he helped her put on her stockings in the morning. No, not much of a surprise, really, that baby number one came along 9 months and 10 days after the wedding. And if we look at the next image, you can see the family in 1846. So Victoria and Albert had been married here for 6 years. And in that 6 years, they've managed to produce 5 children, which is pretty good going, especially for a woman who didn't really like children and certainly didn't like being pregnant. She absolutely loathed being pregnant. But, you know, if you're a monarch, you have to produce heirs, and Victoria produced many, many heirs. Over the years, of course, Albert and Victoria's children married into many of the royal families of Europe. And if you look at the monarchs of Europe today, even the deposed ones, then most of them descend in some way from Victoria and Albert. In this picture here, you can see the 5 eldest children. The oldest boy is the one in red, who's just next to Victoria. And that's Prince Albert, named after his father. He later became King Edward VII. And he is our current Queen's great-grandfather. And if you look at the little girl in the middle, that's the second daughter, that's Princess Alice. She is the great-grandmother of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. So both the Queen and her husband, Prince Philip, descended from Victoria and Albert through different lines of the family. If we look at the next picture, we will go on 10 years. Now, the production line slowed down a little bit. In that 10 years, they only produced another 4 children, making a total of 9. And then the family was complete. You can see little baby Beatrice, the youngest one, lying there on her mother's lap. This was probably Victoria's happiest time. You know, she got her 9 children there. She was very happy and contented with Albert. What could possibly go wrong, you might ask? Well, in fact, Victoria's life was about to fall apart completely. Just a few years after this picture was taken, she had one of the worst years of her life, her annus horribilis, if you like, of 1861. Started badly, she lost her mother in March, and although she hadn't been close to her mother for many years, the death of Victoria's mother really hit her very hard, and she went deep into mourning. Far worse was to come later that year, in December, when on the 14th of December, Albert died. Now, it's difficult to overestimate the effect that Albert's death had on the Queen and the rest of the country. It was so unexpected. He was 42, you know. He hadn't really had that good health. No one really knows why he died, actually. At the time, it was put down to typhoid fever. That's what's on the death certificate. That's not a common theory these days. The symptoms seem to indicate a much longer-term disease, something like stomach cancer or Crohn's disease is a popular theory at the moment. But although he'd had bouts of ill health, no one expected him to die, least of all the Queen. The first inkling that the population at large heard that something terrible had happened was the tolling of the church bells, because Albert died on a Saturday evening about 10 p.m. at night. And just after midnight, the great bell at St. Paul's Cathedral, Great Tom, started to toll. Now, that bell only ever tolls for the death of an important member of the royal family or an important member of the clergy. And the fact it was ringing just after midnight told the citizens of London something terrible had happened. And then as people woke up that Sunday morning, they could hear their local church bells tolling as well. And when they went to church, they learned of the death of Albert. Victoria was plunged deep into mourning. She would remain in mourning for the rest of her life. She would always dress in black, and she cut herself off from public life. There was a long period when Victoria just was not seen. She became known as the Widow of Windsor. The general public was pretty tolerant of this, at least to start with, but as the years rolled by, people thought we should be seeing our Queen. You know, it's 5 years, 10 years since Albert died. It's about time she showed herself to her public again. Someone actually put a notice up on Buckingham Palace gates saying premises to let due to the owner's declining business, which rattled the establishment a bit. Through all her mourning, there was one man who Victoria would confide in, one man whose company she would enjoy, and that is this man here. Now, he's not a member of the family. He's not a politician. He's not another king or queen. This was a servant. This was her Highland servant, a man called John Brown. John Brown had known the couple. He'd worked for Albert and Victoria in Balmoral in Scotland. And he was brought down to Windsor really to try and cheer up the Queen, get her to get some fresh air. And he succeeded. He succeeded far too well for her courtiers like him, because the two became inseparable, really. Albert will be Queen Victoria, John Brown will be Queen Victoria's constant companion. He would be the last person to see her before she went to bed. He would be the person who woke her up in the morning, and they would go on long trips in the country, just the two of them. And people started to ask if something was going on. She got the nickname Mrs. Brown. You might have seen the film with Judi Dench and Billy Connolly that tells you about this period of history. There was even rumours of a secret marriage between the two of them. What was the truth then behind Victoria and John Brown's relationship? Truth is, we don't know. You know, the two protagonists are long dead. Victoria's journals were heavily edited after she died. So there's no real evidence of anything more than a strong friendship. But there is a little piece of evidence that does tell us a lot about the relationship, I think. And that doesn't come from any royal archives. That actually comes from the archives of Victoria's doctor. It was a list of instructions that she gave concerning her death. In the months leading up to her death, Victoria drew up a 12-page pamphlet on everything that should be done as soon as she died. And that included a list of 16 items that she gave that she wanted placed in her coffin. Now, note she didn't give this list to her family because she didn't think her family would carry out her wishes. So she gave it to her doctor instead. When you see what's on the list, you'll perhaps understand why. Obviously, there were some things of Albert. She wanted Albert's dressing gown in her coffin. She wanted a plaster cast of his hand. Now, she'd had this plaster cast made just after Albert died, and she slept with it every night for the rest of her life, this plaster hand of Albert. She wanted that placed in the coffin. She wanted to wear her wedding ring, and she wanted her bridal veil, that white bridal veil, also to be worn. But there were other things as well. She wanted another ring placed on a finger, a ring that John Brown had given to her, a ring that belonged to John Brown's mother. And in her hand, she wanted placed a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair. And the doctor did that. He placed all these things in the coffin, and then he covered up her hands with flowers. So when her children came to pay their last respects, they couldn't see these additional items that had been added to the coffin. And that's how Victoria was buried. And I think the fact that she wanted to go into eternity with objects from Albert and John Brown shows that whatever happened, these were the two most important people in her life. Now, John Brown died in 1883. The man who was with Victoria really constantly for the last 14 years of her life was an even more unexpected person. This was not just a servant. This was an Indian servant. Can you imagine what the Victorians made of that with their delusions of empire and grandeur? This was a man called Abdul Karim. He had been brought over from India, from Agra, to wait on the Queen for her Golden Jubilee in 1887. She'd just become Empress of India, so she thought she should have some Indian servants, and he was one of the ones brought over. When he first met the Queen, he threw himself at her feet and kissed her feet, which kind of got Victoria's attention. She thought that was interesting, and she decided she wanted to see more of this man, who she thought was very handsome. And they started having meetings, and he started becoming her teacher. She called him her munchi, which is a Persian word for teacher. He taught her Hindustani or Urdu, so she could actually write and understand the words of some of her subjects. And they became very, very close, much to the distress of Victoria's family. Now, Victoria died before Karim, and as soon as she died, her successor, Edward VII, had Karim thrown out the country. He was sent back to India. All his possessions, things given to him by the Queen, correspondence between them, that was all burned. And Karim was put down in history as a bit of a con man. He'd wormed his way into the life of this poor old lady and was exploiting her. That's how they wanted us to remember him. I'd like to think that the relationship was a lot more balanced. I mean, the fact they were together for 14 years, that Victoria kept him close to her for 14 years, showed there was a genuine friendship. And they both probably got something out of the relationship. Karim obviously got to go places he'd never, ever get to without being the companion of the Queen. But Victoria got a good friend in return, and someone whose company she very much enjoyed. And so I think there was more than just a con man trying to exploit an old lady. Victoria died in 1901, January the 22nd, 1901, just a few days into the 20th century. that was very much the end of an era. When she died, she'd been on the throne for 63 years. So there was relatively few people alive who could remember any other monarch than Victoria. It's pretty much the same today. You know, there's very few people who can actually remember life before Queen Elizabeth. And it was very much the end of an era. I'm going to leave you with a different picture of Victoria. This is a very unusual picture because we're so used to see her looking very solemn, very regal. This is a much happier Victoria. This is the Victoria I like to think was the real Victoria, the one you would find behind those net curtains of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. The Queen who was so amused by Albert, who got on so well with John Brown and was protected so much by Abdul Karim, the real Victoria behind the personage. Thank you very much for listening. Do come and visit us. Come and visit some of those sites in London to do with Queen Victoria. If you want to know more about the Queen, then this is an app I wrote over the winter. It actually details all members of the royal family right back to William the Conqueror in 1066. It tells you where they were born, where they're buried, where they died, who they married, and also gives details of their children. So there's over 900 people in the database of the app now. So go to iTunes or Google Play. You can find it there. Just search for Royal Family Tree, and hopefully you can enjoy it. Leave a review as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a phenomenal talk. I've heard it before, but even every time I hear something new, just so many interesting facts. Thank you very much. And what I love particularly about it is we have this, most people around the world have this image of Queen Victoria as this kind of miserable, dressed in black, rather kind of larger figure who can essentially shuts the world out. But it's fascinating to think that in the later years of her life, she had two companions who were just so different from each other.
Absolutely, and so unexpected. You know, you don't get servants being friends of queens like that, and you can imagine the shock of her children. That, you know, she would send them away, and she'd much rather be with John Brown or Abdul Karim than she would with any of her children.
And it's also worth mentioning that because Leila mentioned the film The Favourite earlier, the movie about Queen Anne that came out last year. But there's also two really good films about the later period of Queen Victoria's life. So you've got Mrs. Brown, starring Judi Dench, I believe. And then you've got Abdul and Victoria as well, which is a more recent.
That came out a few years ago. That was actually based on the diaries of Abdul Karim. So although all Victoria's correspondence regarding that relationship was burned, Karim did keep his own journals, and they were discovered in about 2008, I think, and they filmed the basis of the film Abdul and Victoria and Abdul, with Judi Dench again playing Victoria. She does do a very good portrayal of Queen Victoria.
Oh, fantastic. And Leila, so I've got to ask you, what is your favourite room at Kensington Palace? Do you have a favourite?
I definitely do. And my favorite room is the Queen's Gallery in the Queen's State Apartments. It's a very long room, all covered with oak panelings. And it has this noble sense of restrained dignity and warmth at the same time. When Queen Mary was alive, she had songbirds displayed in the windows and hundreds of pieces of porcelain, and also her pet dogs and red cushions for them and other exotic things there. And she used to have tea, and this was a center for the palace gossip. But I find it very cozy.
Thank you. And it is worth mentioning, you did mention about if you don't have £100,000, ladies and gentlemen, to hire the palace for your wedding or an evening soiree, you can actually visit during the day. It's open 7 days a week when the lockdown lifts. And here is the web address if you want to book tickets online. They are a charity, so the money doesn't go into the royal pockets. It actually goes for the conservation of the buildings. And so let's do what we can to support this royal heritage. We've also had lots of lovely comments, mostly praising you guys, saying you're better than sliced bread, how fabulous. We've also got people dialing in from around the world as well, including Montreal. So see if I can see. Here's Ruby. Ruby was the president of the World Federation of Tourist Guides Association. So we have a VIP in the house. Let's give it a whoop whoop for Ruby.
Very honored.
Ruby. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you are looking in for the first time and we've now whetted your appetite about Guide London, here is the Guide London website. So you can actually go to Guide London. You can search by guide name, you can search by theme, you can search by popular tour. Remember, there are nearly 600 Blue Badge guides on that list. And if you want to make sure that you find Nick and Leila, let me just give you, let me just put up their information as well. So this is Nick's website address, guide.salmond.info. And also you'll find Leila on the Guide London website. And this is her address if you want to find her as well. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure to bring this broadcast. We hope that we've whetted your appetite, giving you a little flavour, a little sprinkling of some royal stories and royal gossip. And just to let you know, on Friday at 4, we're going to be looking at some of London's most iconic sporting venues. And so we really hope that you can join us. And we also hope that you will share this broadcast to your friends and spread the word. And hopefully when lockdown ends, London will be at the top of your list. Enjoy the rest of your day, ladies and gentlemen. Stay safe and well, and thank you for listening.
Goodbye.